every day is the future of French democracy. General de Gaulle used to say the French people just want to take away the power to the people they have just chosen to govern them. So it's quite difficult to speak about African democracy, but I want first of all say that history and tradition can be made to say anything, and let's look at the facts. The African continent today has democratic institutions, and this implies very precisely a constitution guaranteeing the separation of executive, legislative and judicial powers, the protection of human rights and fundamental liberties, and a multi-party political system. Apart from a few exceptions, this situation now exists everywhere in Africa. In theory, everything is perfect. The institutions are in place, often the result of an important national congresses held in the 90s. Sometimes, however, certain temptations persist here and there to prevent opponents standing for election on a judicial pretext, or to modify the constitution as an election approaches in order to allow a third or fourth mandate. The problem is that we are no longer in the 1990s, when the French President François Mitterrand, after the fall of the Soviet bloc, urged this African colleague to authorize multi-party system. We are now in the aftermath of the Arab Revolution, which arose on this continent in Tunisia. Thanks to Facebook and social networks, people burst through the wall of fear and changed the course of their history to demand not formal but real democracy. The tremendously fast development of digital technology in Africa is an inevitable factor of change. By means of mobile telephone rather than computers, Internet penetrates the whole of African society. The worldwide companies have understood this. Google develops its version in several African languages. Microsoft has joined up with an African firm to produce affordable smartphones. Not to mention certain Chinese companies that now sell low-cost 3G keys. A new aspiration for greater transparency and justice is emerging, especially within the younger generation. This is apparent in the denunciation of corruption in the ruling classes and in calls for a fair distribution of the resources of a continent so rich in raw materials and energy sources. The refusal to allow impunity to those who break fundamental rules is similarly evidence of this new aspiration. I was impressed by the progress made over a few years by our African partners. We can say that an authentic silent revolution is being led. The most obvious sign of the existence of political choice, by which true democracy is distinguished from a merely formal one, this has come about peacefully in Ethiopia, in Senegal, in Guinea and elsewhere. Symbols such as the accession of women to the highest state position also testify to progress. It is a difficult objective for both northern and southern countries. In France in 2008, when I was Prime Minister, I had to resort to a reform of the Constitution to establish the principle of equal access of men and women to electoral mandates. In these fields, Africa is today an example. Liberia has elected a woman to lead the country. In the Central African Republic, Catherine Samba Panza is directing the political transition in very difficult conditions. The government of Senegal is led by the courageous Aminata Touré, whom I met last year in Dakar just after her nomination by President Macky Sall. During my 5 years at the head of the French government, I was very often in contact with those in political office in Africa, very openly and directly. My first trip to Africa was actually to Nigeria and to Port Harcourt. From these experiences, I retained 3 reflections on the challenges facing African democracy. First reflection, the most dangerous and immediate danger lies in the conduct of political transition. Election periods are full of risks. Risks of ad hoc constitutional revision to allow a head of state to continue in office. Risk of tampering with results causing one side to opt for violence. Risk of state takeovers or seizure of power by military forces. Risk, and this is the most serious, of an ethnic bipolarization of the vote, which opens the door to ethnic confrontation. I was directly involved with such a situation in 2010, after Laurent Gbagbo refusal to recognize defeat in the Ivory Coast election. The spiral of violence led us to reinforce our military presence in the country in order to support more efficiently the United Nations force on the ground and within the frame of Security Council 1975 resolution. From Paris, we also see a major geopolitical change in the increasingly powerful position of the Economic Community of West African States, the Economic Community of Central African States, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development in the Horn of Africa, or the Community for Southern Africa Development. A priority of this organization has been the good conduct of democratic and electoral transition, which has been included in the text. The African Charter for Democracy, Election and Government, adopted in 2007 by the African Union, not only mention fundamental principles, but specially envisage in Chapter 8 sanction or suspension in several cases. State takeover, non-respect of election results, using rebel movement to overthrow a legitimate government, and something completely new, constitutional revision that harms the principle of democratic political choice. The Economic Community of Western African States Protocol on Democracy and Good Government goes even further. It explicitly forbids any reform of electoral legislation in the 6 months before an election. Is it more difficult today to violate fundamental democratic rules? Without doubt, when regional organizations have the determination to enforce them. The institutional crisis in Madagascar was resolved thanks to the firm position of the Community for Development in Southern Africa, which demands that the country's most contested political figure be barred from running in the presidential race. But much remains to do. In Mali, where presidential and legislative elections have failed to open the path to an indispensable dialogue between North and South, in the Central African Republic, where the possibility of election envisaged before February 2015 no longer seems viable. I hope that the two economic communities of Western and Central African states will succeed in helping these two countries